I was pulling cedar-lined drawer paper from my grandmother's dresser when my father said my name like it was a formality. He was standing in the doorway of her bedroom. The smell of that cedar had been in the house since I was 7 years old. My grandmother had relined every drawer herself every spring, pressing the paper flat with the heel of her hand. I was doing it one more time because she wasn't there to do it, and because it was the morning before her funeral and I needed something to do with my hands. "Callie," my father said, "when this is over, the house and the property go to the family trust. It's already been filed. I just want you to know." I set the drawer paper down. I didn't ask when it had been filed. I didn't ask which attorney. I didn't ask what the family trust meant or who was named trustee. Kept my voice level. I said, "Okay." He nodded once like I had agreed to something and walked back toward the kitchen. "My name is Callie. I was 34 years old that morning and I had been a paralegal for 9 years. I knew what already been filed meant. I knew what it did not mean. And I knew, standing in my grandmother's bedroom with the smell of cedar around me and a strip of drawer liner in my hands, that what my father had just said was not the same thing as the truth. I set the paper in the drawer. I smoothed it flat. That evening, after the casseroles were put away and my brother had gone back to his hotel, I knocked on my grandfather's door. Earl Sutton had lived in the same house on Millbrook Lane in Hendersonville for 41 years. His house sat 2 blocks from my grandmother's, which was the house she had inherited from her own parents and which my grandfather had spent 23 years helping her pay the taxes on. They had done everything separately and together all at once, the way people of a certain generation did. They kept different accounts. They signed different documents. They understood each other perfectly and left almost nothing in writing between them. Grandpa Earl answered the door before I could knock a second time. He looked past my shoulder. He looked down Millbrook Lane in both directions. Then he stepped back and pulled me inside by the sleeve of my coat. He did not say hello. He whispered, "They moved the deed 3 weeks ago. Before she passed. I need you to sit down." I sat down. My grandfather made coffee without asking if I wanted any. He set a mug in front of me and sat across the kitchen table and folded his hands and looked at me the way he had looked at me since I was small. Like whatever he was about to say, he had already decided I could carry it. Earl Sutton had built 2 things in his life. A small electrical contracting business he started with a $4,000 loan in 1971, and a reputation in Sumner County that took him 30 years to earn. He was not a wealthy man. He had never owned more than 2 trucks at once and he had turned down every offer to expand because he did not want to manage people he couldn't trust. What he had instead was a client list that called him back, a checking account that was always positive, and a piece of property on Route 31 East that he had bought for $38,000 in 1987 because he said the land was good and the price was honest. The contracting business had run for 27 years. He had taken on apprentices twice and let both of them go when the work dried up. Not because he wanted to, but because he had watched other men in his trade overextend and he was not going to do that. When he closed the business in 1998, he had no outstanding debts and a reputation in Sumner County that outlasted the work by 15 years. People still called him when they had questions. He still answered. That property was 6 acres. A small structure on the back of it, a workshop he had built himself with poured concrete and corrugated metal. He had kept his equipment there for 11 years before the contracting business closed. After that, he rented the workshop to a man who restored farm equipment, and the income from that rental, $840 a month, paid the property taxes and left a little over. He told me about the property when I was 22. Not as a gift. As information. He said, "This is what I have. When I'm gone, I want you to know what exists." He did not say my name and my brother's name in the same sentence. That was not an accident. My grandmother's house was different. That was hers from her family and Grandpa Earl had no claim on it. But the Route 31 property was his solely, purchased in his name with money from his business, and the deed had been in a fireproof box in the closet of his study since 1987. He told me that night at his kitchen table that 3 weeks before my grandmother passed, my father had come to him with a document. Said it was a consolidation, Grandpa Earl told me. Said the attorney recommended putting everything into one trust for simplicity. Said it would protect the property from probate. He had signed it. He told me this without looking away. He was 81 years old and he had been a careful man his entire life, and he had signed a document his son brought him without reading it fully because his wife was dying in a hospital bed 12 minutes away and he had not slept in 4 days. I kept my hands flat on the table. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I let him finish. My father and my brother Marcus had known about the Route 31 property since I was in college. Marcus had mentioned it at Thanksgiving once, that workshop land, in a way that said he had thought about it more than once. Marcus was 41. He lived in Nashville and sold commercial insurance and had borrowed money from my parents 3 times in the last decade that I knew about, and possibly more that I didn't. The most recent amount I knew of was $27,000, to cover a gap when his firm restructured. My parents had referred to it as a loan. Marcus had referred to it as the family helping out. I had not referred to it at all because nobody had asked me. I had put myself through school on a partial scholarship and 2 jobs: front desk at a veterinary clinic on weekday mornings and weekend shifts at a copy center that served law firms downtown. That second job was where I first learned what a deed looked like, what a trust instrument looked like, what a quitclaim transfer looked like, and how little paperwork it took to move something from one name to another if no one was paying attention. I graduated in 3.5 years. I passed my paralegal certification on the first attempt. I took a position at Whitfield and Rourke in Hendersonville, and I had worked there ever since, 9 years, handling residential real estate closings and estate transfers, which meant I had read approximately 4,000 documents of the kind my grandfather had signed 3 weeks before my grandmother died. I knew exactly what had happened. I did not say so out loud. My grandmother's funeral was the next morning. I was not going to do anything about this tonight. I was going to sit in my grandfather's kitchen and drink the coffee he had made and let him say what he needed to say. What he needed to say was this: I should have called you first. I knew it the minute your father left. I should have picked up the phone. You didn't know, I said. I knew enough, he said. He was right. But I also understood that grief narrows everything down to what is immediately in front of you. My grandfather had been sitting at my grandmother's bedside for 3 weeks. He had not been reading documents carefully. He had been holding her hand and reading to her from the Bible and watching the window to see what the light was doing. I didn't say any of that either. I just let it sit. What my grandfather had signed, as best he described it, was a trust transfer. A document that moved the Route 31 property out of his name and into something called the Sutton Family Heritage Trust, which named my father as trustee and my brother Marcus as primary beneficiary. My name was not in it. I had been working in real estate law for 9 years. I understood the mechanics of what had been done. I also understood that a trust document signed under those conditions, by a man who was sleep-deprived and grief-stricken and had not had independent legal counsel present, might have weaknesses that a properly prepared attorney could identify and document. I did not say this to my grandfather. What I said was, "Do you still have the original deed? The one from 1987? He looked at me for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the hall closet and came back with the fireproof box. Inside it was the original deed to the Route 31 property, dated October 14, 1987, in Earl Sutton's name, with the property description and the original purchase price of $38,000, and a current county tax assessment clipped to it showing the property's assessed value at $213,500. He set it on the table in front of me. He said, "It's yours now. The copy. I want you to have it." I took the deed copy. I folded it once and put it in my coat pocket. I had supported my grandparents in small ways for several years. Not because anyone asked and not in amounts that felt like transactions. Grocery runs during my grandmother's first round of health trouble in 2019 that I had built into my regular schedule and never mentioned to anyone. The heating bill one January when I noticed the window unit in Grandpa Earl's study was running in the cold because the furnace had a problem he was planning to get to. I had paid the repair invoice, $1,340, and told the repair company it was a gift. My grandfather found out 3 weeks later when he called to pay and they told him it was handled. He called me and didn't say much. Just, "I see." That was the only conversation we ever had about money. My brother Marcus had received, to my knowledge, a car at 18 funded by our parents, a laptop for college, the $27,000 loan in 2019, and consistent informal support I could only estimate. None of this was documented. None of it was considered when the trust document was drafted. None of it changed the fact that in 9 years of working in real estate law, I had never once asked my family for anything. The night before my grandmother's funeral, I sat in my grandfather's kitchen with a deed copy in my coat pocket and a coffee mug going cold in my hands, and I did not argue with any of it. I just listened. I paid attention to what he told me, and I kept very still. That was the history. This is what happened 6 days after the funeral. My father called me on a Thursday evening. I was at my desk at Whitfield and Rourke, finishing a closing package for a property sale in Gallatin. The office was quiet. The overhead lights had gone to their dim evening setting and I was the only one left in the building. He said, "The attorney handling the trust needs a few signatures from family members. Just confirming the structure. Nothing complicated." He said the appointment was Friday afternoon in Nashville. He said Marcus would be there. He said it would take 20 minutes. Kept my voice even. "What attorney?" He gave me a name I didn't recognize. A Nashville address. "Is this the same attorney who drafted the trust?" I asked. Pause. Small. Half a second. "It's the firm handling the estate," he said. That was not an answer to my question. My father was a practical man and a careful one, but he had not worked in legal environments and he did not know what questions sounded like when they came from someone who had. I said, "I'll look at my schedule." I didn't go. Instead, on Friday morning I drove to the office of a woman named Diane Rourke. Not the Rourke of Whitfield and Rourke, a different one, no relation, who operated a solo estate litigation practice on Main Street in Hendersonville and who I had referred clients to twice over the years when their estate matters turned adversarial. I had never had reason to sit across from her as a client before. Her office smelled like printer cartridges and old coffee. She had a corner window that looked out over the parking lot of a dry cleaner. There were 2 framed certificates on the wall and a stack of annotated Tennessee Code volumes on a credenza behind her desk that told me she actually used them. I set the deed copy on her desk. I told her what my grandfather had signed and when. She read it without speaking. She turned it over. She set it down. "Where's the trust document?" she said. I told her I didn't have it yet. She looked at me for a moment. "Your grandfather, he's alive?" "Yes." "He's willing to speak with me?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Hey. Then we have something to work with." She opened a folder and began writing. "A trust instrument signed without independent counsel under the conditions you're describing by a grantor who was in active grief and sleep deprived. That's not an automatic win, but it gives us a foundation. We need the full trust document, the grantor's statement, and ideally a timeline." She looked up. "Can you build a timeline?" I told her I could build a timeline in my sleep. She said, "Good." She put her pen down and looked at me steadily. "I want you to understand the theory here because you'll need to understand it when this gets uncomfortable. What your father did, presenting a document to an elderly man whose wife was dying, without an independent attorney present, without giving him time to review it with counsel, with a filing turnaround of 2 days, that establishes the pattern. Whether the court finds undue influence depends on how clearly we can document the conditions at signing. Grief, sleep deprivation, the absence of counsel, the family relationship between the grantor and the person who benefits. Each one alone is a factor. Together they form a foundation." She paused. "The letter your grandfather mentioned, the one from your grandmother, if it establishes contemporaneous intent, that matters enormously. What does the challenge look like if we file?" I asked. "We file for rescission of the trust instrument on grounds of undue influence and absence of independent counsel. We ask the court to return the Route 31 property to your grandfather's sole ownership. He's alive. He can speak. He can state that he did not understand what he was signing. That's different from challenging an instrument after a grantor is gone." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "This isn't guaranteed. But it's real." I kept my hands flat on my knees. I let that settle. If you've ever been the one who knew exactly what was happening but had to wait for the right moment, this is what that waiting looks like. Doesn't look like anger. It looks like a paralegal sitting across from an estate attorney on a Friday morning, taking careful notes and not raising her voice once. Over the next 4 days I did the following. I drove to the Sumner County Register of Deeds and pulled the original 1987 deed on record, confirming Earl Sutton as sole owner. The clerk retrieved the document without comment. I stood at the counter and looked at the filed copy under the fluorescent light. Earl Sutton's name in the owner block. the legal description of the 6-acre Route 31 parcel, the recording stamp from October 1987. Then I asked for a copy of the Sutton Family Heritage Trust filing. The clerk pulled it in 4 minutes. The trust instrument was filed November 6. The signature page showed November 4. 2 days between signing and filing, which meant the trust had been prepared in advance, ready to receive the signature and filed the moment it was obtained. I stood at the Register of Deeds counter and wrote November 6 in my notes and underlined it twice. 18 days before my grandmother died. I requested a copy of the trust document through my grandfather, who contacted my father to ask for a copy of the paperwork I signed, and received it reluctantly by certified mail. I built the timeline Diane had asked for, 12 pages chronological with document references in the margins, the way I would build one for any case at Whitfield and Rourke. I started with the 1987 deed. I moved forward year by year. Property tax receipts my grandfather had kept in the fireproof box, the rental agreement with the farm equipment restorer, the $840 monthly payment records going back to 2014, the county assessment notices showing the property's value climbing from $89,000 in 2001 to $213,500 at the most recent assessment. Then I documented the recent events. My grandmother's hospitalization in October. November 4th, the trust signature. November 6th, the filing. November 22nd, my grandmother's passing. I did not call my father back about the Friday appointment. He called me on Sunday. I let it go to voicemail. If you've ever been told that something was settled before you were consulted, that the decision had already been made, the papers already filed, the appointment already scheduled, you know the particular kind of quiet that settles into you. Not peace. Something harder than peace. The kind of quiet that has a plan inside it. I took the timeline to Diane on Wednesday morning before work. She read it at her desk while I sat across from her. She did not speak while she read. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. "This is thorough," she said. "It's what I had," I said. "The November 4th signature with the November 6th filing. That's fast. That tells me the trust instrument was drafted before he was asked to sign it." She made a note. "Did your grandfather say the attorney was present at signing, or did your father bring the document to the house?" "He brought it to the house," I said. "My grandfather signed at his kitchen table." She wrote that down. No independent witness. No attorney present on his behalf. Signing in his personal residence rather than an attorney's office. She set her pen down. "Callie, I want to be measured here because I don't want to oversell what we have. But what you've brought me is a real foundation. A grantor in acute grief, signing without independent counsel, at the request of a family member who stood to benefit, with a filing turnaround that suggests premeditation." She looked at me steadily. "That's a trust challenge. What do we need?" "Your grandfather's formal statement, signed and notarized. The sealed envelope if it's what you think it is. And the right moment to present it." My grandfather called on Tuesday. He had received the trust document by then and had read it. He said, "Callie, your name is not in here anywhere." "I know," I said. "I didn't know what I was signing," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that too," I said. I told him I had spoken with an attorney. I told him I wasn't going to do anything that would cause a scene at the wrong time. I told him I was waiting for the right moment. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Your grandmother trusted you. From the time you were small." He paused. "She used to say you were the one who paid attention." I held the phone and didn't say anything. "She left something in the house," he said. "Before she passed. She told me to tell you where it was if things went sideways." He told me where it was. That night. The night before my father had scheduled what he called a family meeting at Marcus's Nashville apartment to discuss the estate, my grandfather called again. He had been thinking, he said. He wanted to tell me something he hadn't said clearly enough the first time. He said, "I told your grandmother once that the Route 31 property was yours when I was gone. I told her that before I signed anything." He knew. "She told me she'd handled her side of it." Kept my voice even. "What did she mean by that?" "I think," he said slowly, "you should look in the cedar chest in the back bedroom. Second shelf underneath the green quilt." I didn't sleep much. In the morning I drove to my grandmother's house. The cedar chest was where it had always been. I lifted the green quilt. Underneath it was a sealed envelope. Written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting was my name. Callie. I set it on the quilt. I didn't open it yet. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room that smelled like cedar and lavender and the particular stillness of a house where someone has recently been alive, and I held it in both hands and I let myself be still for a minute. Then I put it in my coat pocket next to the deed copy. I had a family meeting to get to. Marcus's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in the Gulch with a lobby that smelled like new carpet and recycled air. I had put on my gray wool coat that morning. The one with the deep interior pockets. I had checked both pockets before I left the apartment. Deed copy on the left, folded once, the yellow highlighting visible at the fold. Sealed envelope on the right, my grandmother's handwriting facing inward. I had checked them twice. Then I had locked my door and driven to Nashville on a Saturday morning in December with the radio off. I passed the exit for Goodlettsville without looking at it. I passed the 65S split and the skyline coming up and the Gulch exit, and I took it and parked in the garage. Marcus's building validated for guests, and I sat in my car for 3 minutes with my hands in my lap. The cold when I stepped out smelled like exhaust and something sweet from a bakery somewhere on the block. My breath was visible. I buttoned the top button of my coat and went inside. Marcus buzzed me up without asking who it was. That told me he was expecting me. That told me something else too, which was that they had talked about whether I would come, and they had decided I would. They were right. But not for the reason they thought. The elevator opened onto a hallway with gray walls and a single piece of framed art. Abstract, beige. And at the end of it was Marcus's door, already open 2 inches. I pushed it open. My father was already there. He was standing at the kitchen island with a coffee mug, dressed casually, which was deliberate. This was meant to feel informal. Marcus was on the couch, phone face down on the cushion beside him, which meant he had recently set it down. A woman I recognized as Marcus's girlfriend Tara was in the kitchen. There was a folder on the dining table. One folder centered with a pen laid across it. I read the room in 4 seconds. The folder was for me. The pen was for me. The informal clothes and the open door and the coffee mug were all for me. This was staged to feel like a conversation and function like a closing. Kept my coat on. I set my bag on the floor near the dining table and sat down in the chair that was not closest to the folder. Hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part one most want you to see. My father brought his coffee mug to the table. He sat across from me. Marcus stayed on the couch for another 30 seconds, which told me he was letting my father open. They had rehearsed this too, or something close to it. "We're glad you came," my father said. I said, "Of course." That was not agreement. That was 2 words. He pulled the folder toward himself and opened it. Inside was a document. He turned it so it faced me. It was a beneficiary acknowledgement form. 1 page with a signature block at the bottom. It listed the Sutton Family Heritage Trust as the controlling instrument and named Marcus as primary beneficiary and trustee in succession. There was a line for my signature under a clause that said I acknowledged receipt of the trust terms and waived any further claim to assets held therein. I looked at the document. I did not pick it up. "What is this for?" I asked. "It's just a formality," my father said. "The attorney wants family members to acknowledge the structure. It's standard." Kept my face still. "Which attorney?" "The trust attorney." "You don't know him." "What's his name?" A small pause. "Garrett." "Does Garrett represent the trust or the grantor?" My father looked at me. "He represents the estate." "Those aren't the same thing," I said. The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus came to the table and sat down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The particular look of a man who has decided he is the more reasonable person in a room and is waiting for the other party to realize it. "Callie," Marcus said, "this isn't a fight. We're not here to fight. This is what Grandpa signed. This is what the family agreed to." I kept my hands flat on the table. I let him finish. "Nobody's taking anything from you," he said. "There wasn't anything to take. The Route 31 property was never in your name." I didn't answer. "It was Grandpa's," he said. "He made a decision about it. That's his right. We're just asking you to acknowledge it so the estate can close." He folded his hands on the table and waited. I let the silence stretch. I waited until it had filled the room completely. until Tara had found something to do in the kitchen that required a cabinet to open and close, until my father had set his coffee mug down and Marcus had shifted in his chair. Then my father said it. He said, "You were never the one he trusted with this, Callie. He loved you. But this kind of thing, the business, the property, that was always going to go through Marcus. That's just how it is." Kept my face still. I kept my hands flat on the table. I let that sit. My father picked up the pen and held it out toward me. "It's just a signature," he said. I looked at the pen. I looked at the document. I looked at my father. Then I stood up. I didn't reach for the pen. I reached into my left coat pocket. I took out the deed copy. It was folded once, the yellow highlighting visible along the top edge where I had marked the property description and the owner's name and the original purchase date. I set it on the table to my left. Then I reached into my right coat pocket. I took out the sealed envelope. My grandmother's handwriting on the front. My name in blue ink in her hand, the letters slightly uneven in the way they always were after her arthritis got bad. I set it on the table to my right. Then I reached into my bag and took out the 12-page timeline I had built for Diane Rourke, paper clipped at the corner with the Sumner County Register of Deeds stamp visible on the top sheet. I unfolded the deed copy slowly. One fold. Then flat. I laid it in the center of the table between me and my father, with the property description facing him, the yellow highlighting on Earl Sutton's name and the date October 14, 1987, and the legal description of the Route 31 parcel. The paper made a small sound when I laid it flat. Nothing dramatic. Just paper. I said, "The trust document was signed November 4th. This deed was recorded in 1987. The property was assessed at $213,500 at last county notice. Your father signed a document transferring it without independent counsel present and without reading it in an attorney's office. He signed it in his kitchen. 11 days before Thanksgiving. 18 days before my grandmother died." Marcus looked at the deed copy. He looked at the timeline. He looked at the envelope. "What's in the envelope?" he said. "A letter," I said. "From who?" "From Grandma." My father set the pen down. I looked at him. "You said I was never the one he trusted with this kind of thing." He didn't speak. "You were right about one thing," I said. "This was always Earl's decision. It was his property and his decision and no one gets to override that." I looked at the deed copy. "What you missed is that he already made the decision. In 1987. And he told me where to look." I picked up the sealed envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single page in my grandmother's handwriting, dated October 9th, 2 weeks after she went into the hospital, 13 days before she stopped being able to hold a pen. I didn't read it aloud. I read the relevant section to myself, then set it on the table next to the deed copy face up so that my father could see her handwriting and the date and the line that mattered. The line that mattered said, "Earl and I agreed. The Route 31 property goes to Callie. He told me so in September. If something happens to that agreement before I'm gone, this letter is proof of his intent and mine." Below it was her signature. Below that, in a different pen, was a line I hadn't seen until I opened the envelope. A second signature dated the same day. The hospital chaplain's name printed beneath it with the word witness. The room was very quiet. Marcus's jaw went tight. I watched it happen, the slow clench of a man recalculating. His hands, which had been folded on the table, separated and went flat. He looked at the letter. He looked at the deed copy. He looked at the timeline. He did not look at me. My father's face had gone a color between gray and pale, the particular color of a person who has just understood that the sequence of events is not going to resolve the way they planned. His hand was near his coffee mug and he did not pick it up. He went very still. His shoulders, which had been set forward and certain when I walked in, settled back without him noticing. Tara set something down in the kitchen. A glass, carefully. The sound of it was very deliberate, the sound of a person choosing not to be heard choosing. No one spoke. Marcus said, That letter isn't a legal document." "No," I said. "It isn't. But it establishes intent. And when it's submitted alongside a challenge to the trust instrument on the grounds of undue influence and absence of independent counsel, it becomes relevant to a court's reading of your grandfather's intent at the time of signing." Kept my voice even. "My attorney agrees." Marcus looked at my father. My father looked at the table. You have an attorney, Marcus said. It was not quite a question. I've had one since the week after the funeral, I said. Another silence. Longer. Marcus said, Callie, this is going to cost everyone. You said family shares everything, I said. I kept my voice level. I thought about that phrase every year that I paid for things without telling anyone, without asking for anything back, without putting my name on it. I picked up the deed copy and folded it once and put it back in my left coat pocket. I picked up my grandmother's letter and put it back in my right coat pocket. I picked up the 12-page timeline and slid it into my bag. I'm not asking you to share anything. I'm telling you that Diane Rourke is filing a challenge to the trust instrument on Monday unless your father contacts her before then to discuss a voluntary restructure. I picked up my bag. My father said, Callie. Diane's number is on the last page of the timeline, I said. I left you a copy. I had not. But I set one on the table. A second copy I had made Friday afternoon, paper-clipped, with Diane's card stapled to the front. I looked at my father. I looked at Marcus. I looked at the beneficiary acknowledgement form with the pen still lying across it. I'm not signing that, I said. Then I walked out. The elevator was waiting. The doors closed. I rode down 14 floors in silence and walked through the lobby that smelled like new carpet and pushed through the glass door into the cold December air. My hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time. I sat in my car for a moment. I did not cry. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular stillness of something that had been a question for weeks and was now simply a fact. I started the car and drove home. I know what happened next because Tara told me 6 weeks later, when she and I crossed paths at a grocery store in Hendersonville and she stopped me in the produce section and spoke quietly. She said Marcus and my father sat at that table for a long time after I left. She said neither of them spoke for several minutes. She said my father eventually picked up the beneficiary acknowledgement form, looked at it and set it face down. She said Marcus picked up Diane's card and read it twice and set it on top of the form. She said, they didn't know what to do with you not yelling. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The assumption that I would argue. That I would raise my voice. That the meeting would be loud and emotional and end with someone crying and that person would be me. They had prepared for that version. They had staged the room for that version. The casual clothes, the open door, the pen laid across the form like a foregone conclusion. They had not prepared for 12 pages of documented timeline and an attorney's name on a card. Tara said one more thing before she moved on down the aisle. She said, I'm sorry I didn't say anything in the room. I told her it was all right. She hadn't needed to. The facts had spoken for themselves. 3 weeks after that Saturday my father called Diane Rourke. I don't know exactly what was said. Diane told me the conversation was brief and that my father asked whether the challenge could be avoided if the trust were amended. Diane told him that would depend on the amendment. It took another 6 weeks. In the end, the Sutton Family Heritage Trust was restructured. The Route 31 property was transferred back to my grandfather's sole ownership by his request, with a recorded letter of intent designating me as beneficiary upon his death. Marcus remained in the trust. The Route 31 parcel was removed from it. My grandfather called me on the day the paperwork was finalized. He said, it's done. I said, I know. Diane called me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she would have wanted to see that. I didn't need to ask who he meant. You said it was already settled. I thought about that phrase every time I drove home from the Register of Deeds with documents you hadn't read. You said it was never really mine to get involved in. I thought about that every time I sat across from Diane and answered her questions and built the kind of file that wins. You said I was never the one he trusted with this kind of thing. I thought about that on the morning I walked into that room with everything I needed already in my pockets. I kept working my shifts at Whitfield and Rourke. I drove the same road home. I made the same coffee in the morning. 6 months after the trust was restructured, my grandfather and I drove out to the Route 31 property on a Tuesday afternoon and he showed me where the property pins were and we walked the perimeter and he told me about the man he had bought it from in 1987 and what the land had looked like then. I didn't say much. I just walked beside him and paid attention. The way I always had. The people who decide you can be managed are only ever telling you what they think of themselves. Not what you are worth. And what you have built in quiet, what you have paid for without announcing it, what you have held steady through every season they were certain you would fold. That does not disappear because someone files a form. It waits. And when the right moment comes, you reach into your pocket and you lay it flat. If you have ever been the one who knew, who kept the records, who held on without making a sound, let this be your sign. The quiet ones always know exactly where the deed is. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs it.